Um, there we go. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. Our guest today is Brian Crabtree from Monome. I've known Brian for, I don't know, 7 years through UC San Diego and then Cal Arts. So I think what Brian's going to talk about today is a pretty amazing story, as it is, of a great art/business model that's sustainable and I think a really great model to look at and think about how artists can survive and live in the world really on your own terms to some extent, doing what you want to do without doing very much that you don't want to do, I assume. But I don't know all the all the gory details.
Yeah.
There probably were a lot of gory details, but we won't talk about those. Right?
Oh, no, we're talking about that.
Okay. And also, Brian is a performer as well, so he'll start out with a musical performance on the Monome, I assume.
Yeah.
And then we'll do questions and answers, and Brian will be here for the whole week for a workshop, as a bunch of you know about, and on Friday at 5, there'll be sort of a wrap-up of the workshop with some kind of musical performance.
A bit.
And one other announcement is we had a change of lecture for next week, so Machiko Kusahara will be speaking on Tuesday at 6, and I think that would be a very interesting lecture about Japanese gadget art or Japanese device art. Is that what it's called? I've seen her speak a few times. Really interesting look at what's going on in Japan, which is always crazier than what's going on here. So I think that's that, and let's welcome Brian. And,
Thanks. Again, I'm Brian. We're on our 3rd year of doing Monome now, and it's a sort of company business that evolved out of our practice early on musically. For any of you who are not familiar with this, I was going to do a short performance which fundamentally revolves around this small grid up here. So if you're far away, I'd highly encourage you to come closer. Your neighbors will forgive you. Really? Come on. Thank you. So that was fundamentally, okay. So I came at this initially from a musician's perspective. I grew up doing a lot of like playing with computers as a kid, and ended up doing a little bit of engineering in school. But the goal was sort of always to be able to make music with computers in a way that created less barriers between myself and the actual music making process. I found that the way to actually do that was to be able to have something that could operate as an instrument instead of having the computer be something more that was something for checking your email. This has been the sort of culmination of this. The beginning point, much before I actually understood anything about how to do anything with manufacturing, make something pretty. This is literally a 2x4 that the first prototype came in like right around when I was at the end of my time at UCSD. So just, a perf board, really terrible soldering. And that was really the best I could do, but it proved the initial proof of concept that what this thing is it's openly programmable. There's a bunch of buttons. So these are all keypads, and then there are LEDs underneath of them. And what that allows me to do is when I touch any of the keypads, that gets sent to the computer. The computer is running a sort of program, which you saw earlier, that decides what to do with those keypads, and then sends some data back to the device, which then updates the LED, so what's happening on here. So this ends up being a surface in its own, which reacts to the way that I play it so that I can visually see what's happening. So I'm spending less time looking at the computer. This was the second iteration, and really what let me first start really performing more consistently with it. And I think most of the pieces of this were purchased at like a Michael's craft store. Like all of the wood in between. There's a terrific amount of hot glue involved which I later learned hot glue was allegedly invented for the electronics industry as an insulator. So it wasn't initially for scrapbooks. But the inside is not only complicated, but kind of a mess and prone to failure. Additionally, the sort of process of wiring this together made me realize that making anything in any sort of quantity was going to be either a terrific labor or somehow, cost a terrible amount of money to have somebody else do it. But it worked, and eventually I got it into the hand of a friend who started touring all over the world with it. And in addition to me performing around LA, I just started having emails pour in that people wanted to be able to do similar things. This wiring right here maybe took like 19 or 20 hours, and a lot of bleeding. Around the time that we were just starting to get a lot of interest in other people getting a hold of the device, I met Kellie Cain. I'd like to mention that it's too bad that Kelli can't be here. She's actually at the farm waiting for our delivery of orchard trees, which would be terrible if they show up and can't get in the ground. Because this talk is normally more like how our business is run, which is sort of like married people arguing. So anyway, when we met, we started collaborating on a lot of mechanical installations. This was the kind of striking point where we started learning how to legitimately build things in terms of working with a mill and working with different tools and being able to fabricate something that actually looked like it could be an actual device. And that definitely facilitated our early steps in sort of being able to produce, or at least encourage us to produce these on a scale to get them in the hands of other people. So how did that work? This was an installation that is a robotic egg tapping drum machine. It's about 16 of these little eggs on these pedestals. They'll have a contact mic on the side, so it's kind of replacing the drum with the egg. This is a big ostrich egg. And then there were little solenoids that basically tapped everything. The whole thing was controlled by a sort of algorithmic composition system. So when we decided that we maybe would try to make 100 of these grids, we realized that basically the limitations were going to shape how we did for lack of a better word, the business model. So we knew we didn't have any money. We knew that we couldn't pay a lot of people to actually help us, and so it would have to be mostly handmade. We'd have to be able to do all the work ourselves. So, the reason we would only make not very many of these is because the perceived audience is really small. The device itself is not something that you take home and plug into your computer and instantly know what you're supposed to do with it. It has a pretty steep learning curve in terms of having to set up a lot of things on your computer and have a specific idea that you want to use it for this. What I was using it for was sort of sample cutting, like in music performance, but it alternatively can be used for designing any sort of interaction with the computer. Over the years, most of which have tended towards music, because that's what most of the videos which are spread around the internet have been. But we decided to, despite our sort of trepidation, we decided to basically finance this by putting money on credit cards, and luckily our parents took out an equity loan on their house and this sort of thing, and had the confidence in us to pay them back. By the time we actually had these in our hands that we could sell, we luckily sold enough that we were able to repay our loans pretty quickly, and then this basically started a cycle where we could, wait for people to be interested enough in them and then produce a run, much like an artist edition, instead of the idea of undergoing a really large manufacturing process and then getting them in the hands of distributors that then serve as a kind of market for these. So we were instead making these basically on demand. And this is always this was what our workspace looked like right before we moved away from Philadelphia. But everything, most everything was built on that table in the back right there. There's a run of them of us basically refinishing a whole bunch of wood. And our business model was we wanted to stick with our kind of virtue and ethic that it stuck with us through life, and we're definitely tentative to get into business, and that we perceive business as being, this sort of oppressive word, to say the least. But we wanted to source everything as locally as possible, make sure that everything was produced domestically, and kind of have as much of a hand in it as possible so that nothing was kind of outside our control, or that we weren't producing anything basically irresponsibly that we'd feel bad about later. So let's go. I will step through some of the kind of manufacturing that we do. Part of being small and not being able to necessarily afford a bunch of machines, we use through-hole components for most of the LEDs. So we would place 64 of these LEDs for every single device, and then Kelly soldered every single one, which ended up being 64 times 400 something, and that ends up being many, many, many hours of our lives. We did some of the surface mount things by using this kind of stencil method where we'd wipe solder paste on top of the board and then place everything with tweezers, and then we would literally pop them into a toaster oven, and it would melt all the components onto the board. And it actually worked shockingly well, despite the constant paranoia that if it's in there for a little too long, it'll make basically a sort of toxic smoke bomb. And also it's like $100 worth of components that you just burned. Definitely the most difficult part of the production process was figuring out how to make these keypads, and that there wasn't anything like this just available from an OEM manufacturer. This is not a sort of highly in-demand sort of component. Our parameters are pretty stringent in that we wanted it to have a nice tactile feel, and that it was supposed to feel like a musical instrument. It needs to be satisfying, it needs to be really incredibly minimalistic, and in a sense it needed to be easy enough to produce that it wouldn't be terrifically expensive. Part of what was really fortuitous is that Kelly had a friend back in Philadelphia who worked in the kind of medical molding industry, and so he knew all about how to make silicone things, but we definitely didn't know anything about making keypads. So we've been working closely with him. How it works is there are these, what's called a tool that gets manufactured for a really, really lot of money, and they slather a bunch of silicone in there, and then it goes into an even bigger, more expensive machine that presses out the parts. So this is definitely the most sort of intensive industrial process that we're using. The little black thing on the bottom of the keypad is what actually is conductive. So when that presses against the PC board, that's what joins the switch point. The top plates, we found a nice company down in Baltimore to machine all of the plates. There were several occasions where I had to go down and visit them and make sure that everything was going well in terms of quality standards. The enclosure was also tricky. We, in the same spirit as wanting to solder everything ourselves, we thought we would build all of these enclosures on our own, and so we thought we would pour them out of resin. So we basically had this thing machined, and resin is a wild beast that I never learned how to use. But as you can see here, it was a mess, and then this was the best one we ever produced, which had this giant crack in it. So luckily we found out that they could put that same thing into one of their big molding machines, and then they could press out these things made out of silicone. So the first round that we made had these silicone bases. Here's a bunch of them on their way. There's a bunch of them further. And so at this point, we literally were spending every day being factory workers. But I think it sort of predisposed ourselves to that, given that our our manufacturing, our art practice normally had something to do with making a whole bunch of something. When we, initially, this is the smallest one, this sort of 8 by 8. You saw back in the earlier slides that the 16 by 16 was really what I wanted musically, and it was more flexible in that it had a lot more input, and we could let you do just more data density. To actually build a tool that would be large enough to fit into the machine to get like a large silicone cup pressed would have been terrifically kind of expensive and impossible to make. So we decided to move over to wood, which also had a whole new set of parameters we had to figure out. The wood is black walnut from Pennsylvania, right near where we were at. We found a mill that did a really nice job preparing it. The forest that they got the wood from was FSC certified, which is the Forest Stewardship Council. So we knew that we were at least doing our best not to, support long distance shipping and strip farming. Our same friend who did the silicone molding was also a really wonderful furniture maker. So he took it upon himself to basically figure out how to build these things. One of the great things about kind of having this little operation start is that being able to bring friends in and being able to pay them to do what they're good at has been extraordinarily gratifying. Here's a bunch on their way. He of course, got really sick of making these, and so instead of figuring out a better way to build boxes, he decided to figure out how to build a CNC machine. So he spent a ton of time doing this, and now the process is a bit more mechanized, but we still personally spend a terrific amount of time kind of oiling and finishing them and turning them into pretty objects. When scaling up to the larger size, the reason for doing the wood was, because we wanted it to be very big. Scaling up to larger size, we ended up making the panels modular, and they're also two-sided, and everything is surface mount. And we could have done these, well, no, we couldn't. Since it's two-sided, you can't really stick it on one side and stick it on the other side and stick it in a toaster oven. So we had these done by a robot, and much to our dismay, we discovered that the robot could actually assemble everything in something like 2 hours. So it made 1,000 of these boards in 2 hours, and the boards that we hand soldered, it took us 8 months or something. So there's something to be said about that, and I think I've definitely, repetitive labor is a really tricky thing, because there's a point to where it becomes really dehumanizing. This is this great PCB splitting tool, which is really, I'm obsessed with different industrial processes where the tool actually ends up being so satisfying it becomes a weird sort of fetish. So splitting PC boards being one of those. So the business has been a constant balance of deciding when to do something by hand, when to do it ourselves, and when to look for a kind of industrial approach that makes more sense. A lot of the woodworking could potentially be more industrial, but it would take away a lot of the character, and then would require a lot more quality control on our part, which would take possibly just as much effort. These are the logic boards we all assembled. Making circuits is one of my favorite parts. It ends up being, there are parameters and constraints, but within the constraints you have a lot of artistic flexibility, so you can make really pretty objects that are hidden that no one ever sees, but I can be proud of and show you pictures of. And so we make 3 different sizes: small, medium, and the big one. We're working on a new process right now to have a kind of metal enclosure that will then stick into the mold, and it'll be overmolded with silicone. And that has posed a terrific number of kind of technological problems. So to a point, I'm shying back towards wood. There's a sort of idealism that doing a more complicated process will lower the workload, where that just simply isn't always the case. Sometimes using a more antiquated method will save you more time and that you're not chasing some sort of impossible dream. This is Jay operating the keypad mold. One of the components of choosing to use local manufacturing, again, is being able to visit these places so we can see the working conditions and see, I mean, we don't worry so much about how the workers are treated in this country, but certainly if you were outsourcing to China, the kind of environmental impact and the labor impact would be more on our mind. It also allows us to kind of troubleshoot problems really quickly. Like I'm able to personally go over and talk to the person who's working on something like this wood got totally destroyed. And being able to physically be there and convey any sort of problem is much more effective, I mean, despite advances in telecommuting. I mean, add that to a language barrier of a like Far Eastern manufacturing. And this is yet another, these are all different durometer. So what happened was that they all came out of the mold and they have a different feel, which is wildly inconsistent. So it's just quality control and constant sort of responsive design to dealing with problems constantly. Let's see. Also, when we use things locally, they don't have to travel as far. So we're not using as much fuel costs. The total amount of energy going into our parts is hopefully lower. The same kind of applies to doing all of our own distribution. We're not shipping it to somebody who is then going to store it and then use more energy to ship it elsewhere. Part of our sort of artistic approach is both Kelly and I are kind of ardent minimalists and trying to keep everything as simple but perfect as possible. Gave us, I mean, a lot of constraints, but at the same time, only a few opportunities to really make embellishments. So one of the things we're really happy with is how the USB port actually enters the device. Have this like great recessed thing, so it's totally unbroken. The other thing is when you actually turn this thing on, it gives the kind of pattern. So you can see that like it's like an explosion of power. Like previously the idea was just to have it, well, like you turn on a car stereo, it flashes like a huge like glitzy logo. And there's a point to where our identity is not about, you know, establishing a logo or sort of graphical branding, but the choices that we've made both in the production process and in how we've designed the object. So the minimalism itself is what our identity becomes obsessed with. For the first run, those silicone things had no sort of markings, no text, anything on. They were just this like alien object that was totally blank. And actually we got enough requests that people wanted them signed or a mark or something that we bought a literal brand that burns the wood now so people can see that we are saying Monome. Power. Another part of the decision making is dealing with the packaging. The transit is one part. The packaging, we use this great stuff called Gamey, which is 100% post-consumer, but it's also really like light and fluffy, works really well, and it recycles perfectly. So it's just astounding to me that more people aren't fed up enough with packaging peanuts and packaged plastic that they don't demand something different. It's just an absurdity. We also screen print all of our own packaging, which has we didn't expect that it would add so much value, but it ends up that there's people kind of collect the packaging just as much as they're trying to obtain the objects. Another part of the process is constantly trying to take like pretty decent photos, because whenever we post something up to the website, then it circulates a whole bunch of blogs, And so that eliminates the advertising component. Like we've never, ever paid for advertising. Everything has purely existed on the internet. So we do something, we put it out into the world, and then if people like it, it just basically circulates. We've been trying to have, one of the other principles is having as much transparency as possible so that we are communicating, with people directly. Like we're present on the forums, we're in constant email correspondence with people, and being able to kind of show the individual processes. Like at many points we've sort of featured or displayed like different ways that we're making things, or showing our workspace or this sort of thing, so that it's not like a corporation where there's a huge curtain kind of pulled over where you don't know what they're doing or what their motivations are or necessarily where your components are coming from. And in that sense, it opens ourselves up, which then opens up the users, who then, it eventually generates a healthy level of respect, which helps maintain a lot of our ideals. And that's probably most exemplified by the fact that we decided to open source everything. All of the software, the internal software, like the firmware is all open source. The hardware, the schematics, the diagrams for how to manufacture the plate, and then every single application that I've written in Maximus P or in processing or in Shock or in Super Collider, all of these different languages are all posted up. And by kind of doing that initially, it encouraged other people to do the same. And so now on our wiki, it just kind of goes on and on. All of these different applications which people have written themselves and decided that kind of in the same spirit to share them back with other people. So it ends up being this kind of avalanche that is it's a bit of a feedback loop. So part of the reason for choosing to do things open source just is a sort of disdain for patents, which I personally feel really stifle innovation and forces you into a mindset that is really defensive instead of just innovative. So if you spend all of your time worrying about somebody stealing your stuff or trying to prosecute other people that are potentially infringing on your patent, it just takes away from the time that you can spend being creative. And at the same time, the system is such that you have to have a ton of money to actually extract money out of other people who have potentially wronged you. And in the sense that there are, in corporations, there's almost like another arm of the corporation which basically just tries to defend patents. So it's another revenue stream. It's just to me, it's like a very kind of horrifying process that doesn't actually encourage new wonderful things to come about. Given with my hand, having the hardware be open source ends up being a sort of infinite warranty to a degree, because you can open this whole thing apart, you can see the circuit, you can see the schematic online, and you can see all the which components we list, where all of the the part numbers for the components that you can buy. So if it breaks, you can fix it, or if it breaks, you can find somebody else who knows electronics well enough that they can fix it. So you never actually worry about this sort of planned obsolescence or just general low quality manufacturing of things breaking. This is hopefully an object that will withstand the test of time, given that USB doesn't vanish. But even so, on the corollary on the software side, the protocol is open, and so that if applications go away or operating systems update, people will always know how the thing communicates and how the firmware works in order that they can integrate it into their own new applications. This ends up, by having the hardware be open, it ends up being several levels of accessibility. After we produced the initial run of the finished units, we realized that there was a market for people that either couldn't afford it or just wanted to have it be more sort of DIY, but we made a kit so people can get just the boards and the parts. They can assemble that, and they stick it in their own enclosure. People have done some really kind of bizarre and interesting enclosures in the past. One a cigar box, and a makeup case, and a lunch box, and a Bible. By the nature of the hardware being open, it not only kind of encourages modification, but facilitates it. So on the circuit, there are a bunch of extra inputs where people can add different things, like accelerometers to detect tilt, or a series of optical encoders. And then again, since we published the schematic in the board file, if somebody understands how to do such a thing, they can basically hand wire it just the same way I did way back in the day on a breadboard, or design their own PC board and get that produced. And then by kind of opening up the protocol on the software side, it's allowed people to produce sort of clones on other platforms. So like there's an iPhone application that's a Monome. There's a whole Arduino kind of hardware clone package that people are doing, and recently moved to PIC, and there are clones that kind of are created from different weird like commercial music industry stuff. All right. Part of getting the community so on board with producing applications has been, furthermore, that there's a really, really vibrant community in our forum. So what this is, the first thing that comes to my mind personally is that it helps lift a great support load. Basically, people are all really encouraging of one another, and whenever somebody has a problem, there's basically a rapport on the community that people gain respect helping each other out. So in effect, they've removed that element from our business almost entirely. So that, to a degree, to where recently somebody posted on the forum that, I'm having some trouble, can somebody call me up? Here's my phone number. And unbelievably, somebody actually called this person in their own free time and helped them out. Whereas that's something that normally people pay their employees to do. Again, the advertising just happens through people spreading videos around, and the existence of the community ends up being attractive. That kind of pulls people into working with the device to begin with. Given that the steep learning curve, it can be intimidating to work with something that may require some sort of programming or setup. Just knowing that there is a really supportive community of people versus like with a commercial product where you're left with a manual and that's it. In fact, we don't even ship a manual with the box or any software because it seems like the moment you publish something, it will be sort of instantly obsolete, and it's a total waste of paper and material. The kind of community friendliness has extended such that there are constant meetups where people, like a Comic-Con almost, people will get together and meet at people's house and help each other out and play music. There have been a lot of collaborative music albums that people have put together, and it's just really, really stunning. It's not something that I anticipated. Maybe dreamed about that a community would be so supportive, but it's really an anomaly on the internet where a lot of online communities tend to be adversarial, particularly in the sort of music device community. I know that there are other communities that are very nurturing, but it's also something that's made our business totally possible. What do we got? So we released 400 of these, and it actually took us a year to sell all of them, and it really. So this was the point where we realized that we needed to gauge our production according to demand, but quickly it started seeming like demand was always going to outrun what we could produce. And part of part of that was like due to the nature of internet hysteria. I know, isn't this amazing? That it's really hard to actually find reality on the internet, because on a forum, if a few people post that I really want this thing and I can't buy it, it encourages other people to have that same mentality, and then suddenly there might be 20 people in the world that all really want our thing, and they're upset at us for not making more. But then when we make 100 of them and we realize there are only 20 fanatics all yelling, that then it cuts us short. So our constant battle has been trying to figure out how many people really are going to subscribe to this thing. And we've been lucky that an edition goes pretty quickly. And we basically do batches, just like we'd make some paintings or the like. So normally batches of 100, do them every 3 or 4 months, and that sounds like it would be leisurely, but it seems like we're working full time. Yeah, so we let them have one. Which is to say, we just had one laying around. Last year, we had the nice opportunity to actually hire one of our friends to work full time. This is, of course, the first thing that people say is like, if you're working all the time and you can't meet demand, why not just hire a bunch of people? And there are a lot of sort of trade-offs when you decide to invest more deeply in getting more people involved, in particular in sort of training them and then managing them. And we worked from our house, so like having someone in your house, like watching you be married and yelling is awkward. But it was, now that we've moved, I mean, we're actually still considering whether or not hire another person. The sort of quality control ends up being another big issue, because when either Kelly or I, we understand that everything needs to reach a certain point, but trying to convey that to other people is really difficult. In addition to sort of hidden costs of payroll tax and city wage taxes and workers' comp insurance and like all of this stuff, it ends up that I feel like I don't even know if last year was easier than when we were, slaving away. I mean, we were just doing more different tasks and spread out in different sort of bureaucracies, instead of actually feeling like we had regained all of the free time. But at the same time, we effectively, were able to support our friend for a year, which is a kind of amazing, spiritual experience I never thought was possible, that I'd be able to help a friend actually pay their rent every single month, which seemed like a distant dream. We have since moved to a farm in Catskills, but there's more. I think the things I've really taken away from the last 3 years have been fundamentally questioning ideas of growth, and that despite demand, we have found that getting bigger, while there'd be potentially a sort of financial gain, it would just force us to work a lot more, and kind of assessing our quality of life and what the degree to which how much we need to make to kind of sustain ourselves in a way that, we actually enjoy our lifestyle. Getting more money doesn't necessarily mean more freedom in any sort of way. By showing this kind of small market, like in working in your house and producing things that can have some sort of cultural impact, just by setting example, has been really satisfying. There have been a few people ambitious enough to kind of follow the same path, by not getting a lot of venture capital, trying to produce at their home and try to gain a following just through the internet and the actual people that would use them. And so staying small, following our constraints, making sure it's always manageable, and really acknowledging that there are invisible costs to sort of everything. When you buy a $100 barbecue from like a Target or something, it came from China. It's like inconceivable to me how the materials could be cheap enough to merit that. And then but I mean, kind of digging deeper and realizing why it is that cheap is been deeply unsettling. I think that's what has ultimately driven us to make a lot of our decisions. And I mean, in the end, that we're trying to make living our lives as close to our ideals as possible. So we're looking forward to growing a lot of food and continuing Monome in a way that doesn't kind of outrun us to where we can't deal with it in a way that we want any longer. That was rambly. Okay. Should we take some questions? Oh, that was a blur. The microphone.
I enjoyed seeing the whole process, which seems kind of rare to have someone share their entire process, so thanks for doing that. I had a question more about the inspiration for starting this project. One thing that comes to my mind is Dopfer, I think I'm pronouncing that right, the German company, which seemed to sort of slow down in their production, was kind of more popular a couple of years ago, but I think maybe didn't come about at the right time and the scheme of things to sort of have the same excitement that your product has kind of had. And was that sort of a sort of model that you were going after, or something that kind of inspired you? I saw that you had one of their products in one of your photos as well. So
Dopfer it's an interesting idea. Their market is very small. They make analog synthesizers, which is an even smaller subset of musicians in the world. And I don't know a whole lot about their process, but the fact that analog synthesizer manufacturers are passionate enough to continue to exist, because obviously they can't make.
It's not just analog synthesizers. They have,
they have a lot of
huge control module thing, and on their page they have a lot of mods and things, like people like Monome have created these elaborate sort of push button control systems and things like this.
Some of those initial kind of do-it-yourself MIDI hookup box they pioneered, absolutely. I wouldn't say that they were an inspiration. I mean, there's a project called MIDI Box, which is an open source kind of equivalent of that, which was maybe more of an inspiration because they had the tenacity to share everything. And there are just very few instances when people have actually shared the hardware components to show you how something works inside, and then facilitate you not only to make your own, but kind of model something that you make off of what somebody has already begun. And I think that open source has been one of the most kind of fruitful kind of educational components of the internet, I guess. So yes. So yeah, Dopfer absolutely contributed.
But I guess to sort of elaborate, did you, in creating or in coming up with the idea for your object, was it, there's something about the way you make music that other products weren't offering you, that you kind of conceived of it as well? I mean, because there are some sort of control devices on the market, but what about this product is kind of what made you move towards creating it?
I glossed over this at the beginning. When making music is, like in school initially, they have this thing where you can like go to the Guitar Center and buy something, and if you return it within 30 days, they will take it back, no questions asked. And I think that my friend and I basically bought everything in their store and took it back over the course of a year. And so time after time, everything kind of fell short in a sort of way, and it was always in that the manufacturer was designing an interaction or a way to make sound that was according to their engineers or their sound designers, not something that would put the power in your hands to actually shape it into your own. And so by buying something from a large manufacturer, you're effectively subscribing to their creative process. And then by inserting that into your musical product or art product, it's like using a really frivolous Photoshop feature that's like filter that's easy to spot. But in addition, just extending that to live performance, beyond the keyboard or some knobs, it hadn't been pushed terribly far. So I just, after discovering Maximus P, basically, is a way to mediate the computer into doing a lot of the things that the commercial products wouldn't do, the natural extension was to have some sort of controller that would be open-ended enough that didn't have any fixed function so that it could be adaptable. So essentially this ends up being somewhat of a blank slate for a new series of interactions, which I probably haven't communicated because you haven't seen anything else that it can do except for that first little demo. Did that sort of help answer your question? Any other questions? Traveling mic.
I was curious about, in a sense, your competitors. I know the Yamaha Tenori kind of, I'm not sure if that's the right name for it, but Yamaha has a device that's somewhat similar, and I always look at it and think of the Monome first, and I wasn't sure. You're talking about patents and whatnot. You know, how does that apply and affect this?
It's interesting because I think Toshio, he developed that around the same time that I made the prototype. So they were developed in parallel. There's no question about one stealing from the other, luckily, which those accusations are really irritating. But it ends up being a terrifically different object in that he made this really wonderful handheld music making device that has a bunch of functionality built into it. So it's the equivalent of kind of jamming the computer inside of this and a synthesizer and some speakers where you can have it be handheld, you can take it anywhere, and it does these sort of fixed number of functions that he has conceived of, which are really wonderful, like little alternative sort of music box kind of toys. And there's a layer of the Yamaha synthesizer hardware inside of that as well. So really the only similarity, what it comes down to, is the fact that it's a grid of buttons with lights in it, and we also make a grid of buttons with lights in it, but this is a sort of lower level to a certain degree because it doesn't have the functionality built into it. You decide what the functionality is, or you download one of 100 patches that somebody else has designed. And if you don't like the way that it works, you can modify it, or you can even probably ask the author to make a change for you. And more often than not, people have obliged. Recently, Akai came out with another product, which is kind of a direct. They realized that Ableton makes a piece of software called Live, which is really popular for music performance because it does a lot of things that people want really well. And people started using Monome devices to control it, and they obviously saw that people were using Monome devices to control it, and so they eventually came up with something, similar, but there's like a layer of goop on top of it because they have built in all of this other functionality that it ends up doing something similar, but it doesn't have the sort of reductive quality. And while they hint at kind of keeping it open so that it can do different things, the main anticipated function of this device is to be flexible and adaptable to do anything, not necessarily to use it with music. And it just has tended towards music in that most of the applications I was making were musically related and people were touring with them. But we've had them used in like children's museums, and people use them for lighting, like control pieces of their house, or some scientists have used them for neural network research, and I think somebody hooked it up to like the ECU of their car, and like web designers making really abstract calendars out of them. That was more of our hope initially when we made them, but at the same time, it's been wonderful to see how many musician programmers have come up with really elaborate, interesting ways of working with them. So maybe that does it.
What were your like initial experiments that you created? Was the Monome your first idea, and you just were like, okay, I'm going to go with this, and this is what you created, or did you have some other ideas that you started out with, and then you kind of ended up with the Monome?
No, it was, being an undergrad and making different forms of like hip hop and techno. I mean, the grid, it's like a whole musical genre which is confined to a grid to begin with. So I was making max patches confined to the grid, and honestly, making a physical manifestation of just a grid that could have adaptable functions. I must have thought about it, for 2 years before I actually could figure out how to start even moving towards working on it. So no, it was a like spontaneous discovery which I was obsessed with until eventually it has taken over my life in a really weird way. So, anyone else?
Now that you got a farm, do you think that you'll start thinking more about growing stuff and less about electronics?
Yes, absolutely. Well, we have been without internet for 3 months now. We've had dial-up, and the internet doesn't actually accommodate dial-up anymore, so it's been like living without it, which has been shocking. But I don't think I'll start thinking less about it. I think what it will do is it'll allow me to have some sort of seasonality, which I'm really excited about. So in the spring, it's like you're recovering from the winter, and so the sort of planning process, summer you get to watch everything emerge. There's a fall harvest, and all of this will end up being a lot of work. But the winter ends up being, time where you can't really go outside. So that's all time dedicated to, studio work and coming up with new things. And inevitably, we'll have to run editions like in the middle of the spring and summer to keep supporting ourselves. But I'm looking forward to having life be less about sort of freaking out about paying bills. So I think there's a lot more to it.
Just a follow-up on that also is, did you work on a farm or did you just read about it?
No, it's good. No, I totally grew up in the suburbs of San Diego. And I just think over time that, growing food is a sort of, it's a lot of the ideals I've talked about in terms of localization, sustainability, but taken to a sort of extreme, because food is the one thing that everybody engages in, and the way that our country works, and politically, there are great ramifications to what you eat and the way you eat, and so in a sense, it's been our way of pursuing something that we believe in very strongly, and it began just by, actually back with the egg installation, we thought we would print a accompanying sort of pamphlet with, a whole bunch of silly information about eggs. But of course, after we made the diagram of eggs, then we realized there was this whole great world of the modern egg industry, which we knew nothing about. And so that eventually led to us writing a pamphlet about the organic egg industry versus the kind of industrialized egg industry. And so that was the first thing that sort of made us conscious of it. We started growing plants in our backyard in Pasadena, and in Philadelphia we were fortunate enough to take part in a really large community garden. So things just kept getting bigger, and now we have 30-something acres, and I think about tractors and chainsaws all the time. So, but it's good. We're looking forward to it. It's going to be a learning process, and I make no illusions that it'll be easy. But I don't. There's electronics and making music is not going to fade by any means.
Sounds like a perfect next project. Kind of. It's also very repetitive. Not like a huge scale.
You would think that, but I think that working with the land is like the most humanizing sort of process possible, because while farm work, while some of it is repetitive, also the sort of tasks that you're doing change constantly. And when you're outdoors, you're constantly observing a sort of life cycle that is terrifically more interesting than the idea of having an industrial factory job, like those poor people who make our keypads, who basically like shove some junk onto a machine and like pull a lever and pull it off and shove it on. And a lot of our problems with kind of quality control is with keypads being made bad, with dirt getting into them, because I hope our friend isn't watching this. I mean, I suspect that his employees are pretty much demoralized. They don't make very much money. The light is terrible, and so the kind of incentive for them to do good work is not very high, especially that if they get laid off, they get to go on unemployment. So I feel like part of what I'm hoping to see happen in the next decades is that the farmer becomes more elevated. I mean, in much the same light that teachers need to be more elevated, and that farm work is really, really wonderful. So we're hoping to kind of establish a sort of residency. Having the land also allows us to build a lot of buildings. We're really interested in architecture, so we can make a bunch of guest houses so people can come visit and make art and experience farm things. So, any other questions? Done. Thank you. You gonna say anything else? Are you done?
No, it's not that repetitive. But the idea is to do processes that can alleviate some of the repetitiveness, but